Hello, friends. Hello, and welcome to today's Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood. I work at Alta Journal, and I am over the moon to welcome you to today's conversation with author Alexis Madrigal. We're going to be talking about Alexis's new book, The Pacific Circuit, and he's going to be in conversation with Bill Deverell. Bill, William Deverell, as he's known formally and professionally, is the coordinate co-director and founding director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West. You might remember him as the guest editor of our Reckoning with the West issue at Alta. He's a dear friend of ours, and he has just read The Pacific Circuit, Alexis's new book. Alexis is a journalist who lives in Oakland, California. He is the co-host of KQED's Forum and contributing writer to The Atlantic, where he co-founded the COVID Tracking Project. As I was mentioning to both of these two, their resumes are incredible. They just have incredible bodies of work. I encourage you to dig deep. We've got it on our website. But I promise you, they were both extremely legit. So you are in for a real treat today in discussing Alexis's new book with Bill. Before I turn things over to Bill and Alexis, though, I do want to tell you Alta Journal, if you are new to us, is an award-winning quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. Our current issue is 25 books that define California. I met a woman this weekend that has read 20 out of the 25. She holds the record, other than our editorial director. So if you like what we do here, if you like the California Book Club, we've got Mangela Martin coming up. Amy Tan is coming up. All sorts of exciting folks. Ada Limon. We host the weekly Alta Live series. That's also free. If you like what we do, I do hope you'll consider supporting us and subscribing to our magazine. It's $50 a year. You get 4 gorgeous issues. We'll send you a book of cartoons. All of the cartoons that have appeared in our magazine. It's a gift. Please do consider subscribing to Alta. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions of our guest. Bill and Alexis are going to chat for about a half an hour, and they will invite me back at the end to ask any questions on your behalf. It is great to see our audience tuning in from Oakland, LA, San Francisco, Tracy, California, Ramona, Cambria. And don't worry, this will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com. I am going to get out of the way and let these experts handle everything. Take it away, Bill.
Okay, Beth, thank you. Thanks to you all out there for joining us. Shout outs particularly to those of us joining us from Oakland, because that's where we're going to hunker down here in our conversation. It's a pleasure to meet you, Alexis. As you know, I've read the book closely and I'm a great admirer of it, but it's a real pleasure to meet the author behind a really fine book.
Thank you so much. So good to be here, and shout out getting Ada Limon back for the state of California. Just moved back from Kentucky, so that's good for everyone.
So Alexis, let's just start. So we're going to run out of time before we run out of things to talk about. I do urge the audience to please pose your questions in the Q&A, so we'll get to some of them if we can by the end. But this book, The Pacific Circuit, a globalized account of the battle for the soul of an American city. If one were encountering that title without knowing about the backdrop of the book, our urban thoughts would most likely not turn to Oakland as the place where we're battling for the soul. Tell me about the origin of the book, and alongside that, you write the book as if you're a native of Oakland. Your familiarity with Oakland is really profound, in my view. Tell us about your upbringing, because I don't think that's where you're from.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I was born in Mexico. My dad is Mexican. I was born in Mexico City, and grew up actually a little bit in LA. My dad was a Bruin. Sorry, Bill.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I spent a bunch of time growing up in rural Washington State, north of Portland, Oregon, where my Mexican grandmas moved actually when I was a teen. But then I guess about 15 years ago, I moved to Oakland, and I would say that the real origin of the book is probably the only place that I've ever felt like was home for me. Like when I got to Oakland, we moved here. I just moving in the city, being in the city, I was like, this is it. I'm done. I'm done. This is my place. And some of it is the topography, a lot of it is the people, and the particular mix of cultures that we have here and histories. It's just kind of a beautiful, thrilling place. There's so many interesting thinkers and interesting ways of being that exist within the city. Maybe more proximately, though, the origin point of the book was getting out onto the Port of Oakland and trying to make sense of this piece of the global economy that is really physically attached to the city of Oakland in this strange way through 7th Street, and wanting to figure out what the relationship was between the city of Oakland as I know it and like this node in the global economy. And once I realized that, the first major Pacific container ports were in Oakland and Cam Bay in Vietnam, I was off to the races because unfortunately for me, I think I'm kind of naturally historically minded and uh, seeing that as the origin point for this larger set of systems and wanting to understand the relationship with the city kind of forms the whole basis of the book.
Okay, that's a really good answer. Thank you. I want to delve into the tension that I feel in the book between your obvious regard for the place,
Mm.
but a book that is poignant and painful as well,
Mm.
because Oakland, West Oakland in particular, the harbor, they're really impacted places with impacted lives. So we'll get there. Let's talk a little bit about, can you just deconstruct the cover of the book for the
Mm.
audience?
Mhm.
We have this
Sure.
Jenga puzzle of
Hmm.
containers stacked up over historic
Yeah.
Oakland, West Oakland.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about just the tension that you're addressing in the book.
Yeah. So the sort of stack of containers is almost easier to describe. I mean, that's sort of our visual representation of the Pacific Circuit, this kind of set of systems that relies on this sort of physical infrastructure of containerization, the logical infrastructure of computing and information technology to control the movement of those goods around the world. And then the third piece of the Pacific Circuit is actually represented in that bottom photo. What that photo is a World War II era tank running over homes in West Oakland. It was the real first strike in the bulldozing of urban renewal in West Oakland. And I spent 2 years more or less obsessed with trying to figure out like why did that picture exist? Why did the city bulldoze these homes at a time just after World War II when there was a huge influx of migrants to Oakland who needed places to live? So like what was going on in that photo? And probably the first third of the book was just my movement through both local institutional history and trying to combine it with an intellectual history, particularly around how the Chicago School of Sociology and its ideas about city growth and decay became embedded in this sort of mid-tier city. Oftentimes I think people look at who the leaders in a field are, the people who are applying, urban planning in New York or Chicago or whatever. But Oakland really is just this kind of, they're not giving the talks at the conference, our city planners. They're just kind of in the audience, and so it became a really interesting test case of what happens when some of these ideas about the city slipped out of the academy and into both the federal government, but also all the way down to the city level. And so that's that's the cover. That's the cover.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah.
sort of one represents all that historical work, and the other represents sort of what womps down onto it when we get to the second half of the 20th century.
So one of the many things that I found so impressive about the book is that you're working at so many different registers. It's almost as if you've got 4 or 5 desks that you're working at, because on the one hand, you're writing about these supply chains of goods, technology, tracking, global capitalism, global commerce. You're a political economist of maritime travel or maritime shipments, right? So you've
Mhm.
got that very large canvas upon
Yeah,
which
yeah,
you're working, and you figured it out. You're basing it a lot of it on work that's already been done, but you
sure,
brought it
right.
home to roost in West Oakland, where then you remind us it's where it started. So you've got that big register, and then you've got a Oakland register of doesn't drift quite back to the 19th century, but you know as well as I do and our audience does that Oakland is the terminus of the Central Pacific Railroad in 1869. those railroad cars are the precursor to container vessels. There's this sort of historical validity to why you're in Oakland in the first place. So you've got that sort of domestic waterfront and ambitions of the Bay Area after the gold rush. That's really well done. Then one of your other registers is investigative journalism. You're figuring out who's who and who's doing what to whom, and how come West Oakland is always seemingly getting the short end of the stick. And then you've got a novelistic eye about characters, and you found, in particular, a single character, but many characters around which you wrap this story. Tell the audience a little bit, because it's done, to my mind, so well, but I know just enough to know how difficult that is to do. Tell us about working at those different registers as a writer and a researcher.
Yeah. Well, one of my friends, John Mooallem, some people may know his work from New York Times Magazine or other, but he's written books too. One time we were sitting on the island where he lives, like outside Seattle, and he said to me, books are made of other books, and I thought he meant just that, researchers go find books, so like for Containerization, there's The Box by Mark Levinson, or you have The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein or whatever, I thought he meant that. And I think actually, as I worked on this book, which took me 9 years, I realized that actually I probably wrote like 5 books, unfortunately, in the course of working on this. But part of it was like there is a central idea, a central premise, which is just that what happened to this place? Like if you really want to understand what happened on 7th Street, like it requires going to all those registers. And I actually think that's probably where like the journalist in me is kind of rearing its, ugly head. I mean, journalists are sort of, jack of all trades, master of none kind of situation, I think that the core insight of a lot of local journalism in particular, though, is that if you look hard enough in any local place, you will in fact find the whole world there, because that is how it works. That is what life is. That is what modern life is, at least. And I think that was true for me there. Like each one of those, two. For example, there is that photo that is on the cover of the book. It's bulldozing so that eventually this postal service logistical distribution facility will go in. I just, people told me all throughout West Oakland, including Miss Margaret Gordon, the central character in this book, the post office was a huge deal. The post office wiped out all these things. The post office, took out blocks of residential housing, et cetera. And there was an obvious answer to why that bulldozing was done for people in West Oakland, which was essentially racism. Um, but I wanted all of the mechanism of that. Like, if we want to unwind some of these things eventually, we need to actually understand, like, mechanically, how does this happen? Like, within how did these decisions get made? Where did those ideas about the city come from? Why this particular kind of facility? What was happening at the post office? Um, and so really, I think it was just a lot of the work wasn't like, I didn't go in saying, I want to work at all these registers. In fact, I came in saying I wanted to write a slim knife of a book. That's what I told my publisher 9 years ago. But if you want to figure something out, sometimes you got to go to all those places. And I think that's kind of what happened to me.
Yeah, I appreciate the 5 books notion, because the book is jam-packed, but it's very fluid and fluent, because I think you've probably figured out, with perhaps some help with editors at all, how to distill it. And it, to my mind, it works at these multiple levels. Your chapter organization helps, of course, the ways in which you do it. Before we get to Margaret Gordon, in a way, I just heard you basically say this, that you're humanizing, dehumanizing mechanisms, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be related to the pain you feel as a writer and someone so fond of Oakland. Tell us a little bit about writing through that poignancy of the racism, the destruction, the left out of all the goods and capitalistic wherewithal of containerized shipping that starts in West Oakland. Tell us about that kind of, feeling kind of bereft for a place that you love.
Yeah. It's tough, I mean, particularly because I wrote it was about half and half pre and post pandemic, this book. And Oakland went through some very difficult times at the height of the pandemic. Very, 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 very tough, very desolate. And so there were, it's a complicated place always to write about. I think there kind of works for this place kind of flows through me at kind of two levels though. I mean, one is I did grow up with like a Mexican political dad who was very like conversant with a lot of the sort of more revolutionary components of the Black Power movement during the 60s and 70s. So I sort of knew that even in the midst of like all that pain, there had been like tremendous political ferment, which I had been hearing about for my whole life, essentially, and really is something you hear and see a lot on the streets of Oakland. There's a lot of children and grandchildren of Panthers who live here. It feels very like doesn't even really feel like history here. It's like very, very alive in the clothing people wear, the murals on the walls. Like it's very alive. And so I think I didn't want this book to just be about the pain of urban renewal or like the destruction of 7th Street's commercial corridor, those things. Like at all these kind of places where there is this pain, I also knew that there was this tremendous resistance that people are uh, that people bring to it. And so people say this all the time. I mean, just like I don't know why how this is just in the water, but people say like you'll just be at some bar and people will be like, Oakland always comes back. Oakland always comes back, you know. It's just like it's part of the identity of the place to get knocked down and get back up. And so I think that was kind of my core response to a lot of the pain and trying to metabolize what was happening was this understanding that people were always that people had already considered that you know that the people who are working in the community here they already know all that stuff. And so for me it was a learning process, but it wasn't as if I needed to make that clear to the people in the community who were already experiencing those things. It was more about what I called for like newcomers to Oakland getting to zero. You know, how do you get people to understand enough about the history of Oakland so that what people in West Oakland or East Oakland are saying about what's been happening in their neighborhoods makes sense to all the people of the city, not just sort of long tenured ones.
Yeah, it comes through. I mean, it's like the resiliency through getting beaten down, and the scar tissue is pretty
Yeah,
powerful by itself.
yeah, yeah.
You know, when you're grappling with Oakland and this long cycles of global capitalism and how it finds its way, you're in this company of writers of Oakland. You know, my mind turns to Henry George, who reminded
Mm-hmm.
people in the 19th century that the railroad wasn't going to float all boats. You know, the railroad that terminated in Oakland wasn't going to float all boats by any means. Of course, Gertrude Stein haunts Oakland, but
Mm-hmm.
Jack
Mm-hmm.
London, Tommy
Mm-hmm.
Orange.
Mm-hmm.
You feel a kindred spirit with our other Oakland writers in this way?
Yeah, Tommy Orange for sure. Me and our kids go to the same school. I mean, he's like a very Oakland guy, both runners. But probably the person that I feel the most closeness in and sort of overlap of interest is Boots Riley.
Mhm.
Um, you know, we also have both done a lot of stuff for children, like a youth writing workshop here in town called Chapter 510. Another person you just see around town. You know, I mean, it's a small place to house
Yeah,
all these people, but also he's out of a deeply radical tradition, and he also I think Boots also captures some of like the fun of Oakland. I kind of like talk about this Oaklandish, which is a clothing brand here in town, but I also think it's kind of a natural politics of this place as the sort of next door neighbor to the future in San Francisco. I think Boots Riley captures that as well as anyone, that people here really have fun in the streets, you know, in a way that is I mean, of course, it exists in many places, but our version of it is very fun, very absurd, and I think has a certain artistry to it that I've always appreciated.
yeah. So with the one of your hats as a historian in this book, um, I used to live in Oakland, and I appreciate the notion that the era of the Panthers, the era of the anti-war movement, etc. It's very fresh in what you can see in and around Oakland. It's not the ancient past by any means. And yet you're writing about containerization and the revolutionary changes in maritime global capitalism and supply chain. How do you navigate the various moments and relativity of historical eras in this book? Oakland is both a deeply historic place. It's also rapidly changing. It also hasn't changed very much at all. I mean, how do you wrestle with all that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think one component of it, I would say, is that Huey Newton, and I kind of reckon with it in a footnote in the book, complex figure, and there's a sort of veneration for him here that I think needs to at least have some complexification. However, that said, you can read my take on it in the footnote in the book. But as someone who was positioned where he was, he saw very far into the future from the early 1970s in Oakland, seeing the interrelationship between kind of ethics and the changes to supply chains, seeing the Oakland's position within the world economy made it sort of maybe not an early adopter of new technologies alone, but almost like an early adopter of that future economy of precarity, of debt-based immiseration, some of these other things. And I think that made it a little bit easier to deal with because he kind of compresses time a lot, because I'm able to throw forward from those observations that Huey Newton made in talking about what he called reactionary and revolutionary intercommunalism. That allowed me to much leap to the era of globalization, or of what we call, when globalization became a sort of buzzword and there became a resistance to it in the anti-globalization movement in the 1990s. And there's a few moments like that in the book where I'm able to compress things quite a lot, and that was quite necessary, I think, in this book, because there's to try and really do history at all the registers and across all the fields that we're sort of talking about, from roughly 1930 to 2025 would be pretty difficult. And so I had to sort of pick and choose my spots. And most of the time I chose sort of like origin moments. You get much more around the origin of containerization. And when it's just sort of scaling up, doing its thing, there's this sort of compression. You get the sort of origin of Miss Margaret as a community leader, but then sort of when she's sort of just rolling out through that thing, there's a little bit more of a compression. And that stuff felt to me a little bit almost more like that the solution was sort of writerly mechanics more than it was like intellectual. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's my answer.
No, it is a good answer. I'm fascinated by the notion of Huey Newton's prescience.
Yeah.
That there was this prescience and genius to his perspective and anticipation of all these changes.
And it's underrated too. That's the other thing I would say.
What's that?
It's underrated relative to other things that people say about Huey Newton, is what I would say.
Absolutely, and you put credit where it's due in that sense. And then the tail end of the way you just answered this is a fascinating notion that once you've got a manuscript in construction, there's a certain organic quality, right, to it. It sort of doesn't take on its own life, but nonetheless, it's sort of whispering in your ear, like, this has to be short.
Yeah, there's a landscape there, and some things are uphill and some are down, and I think sometimes you have to take the downhill route. You're out of energy in a certain spot, and you can feel it in the manuscript at times.
So many a scholar, perhaps with different disciplinary training or professional occupation, would perhaps take a look at a single container, its traverse across the Pacific, what's inside of it, who made it, who bought it. You have some sensibility of that, of course. But for you, really, this book rises and is the most powerful because of this single figure that, in my view, that you encountered. Talk
Agreed.
to us about, I mean, she's just such a remarkable person, and I feel as if I know her, thanks to you and to her and her dialogue.
Yeah.
But tell us about that encounter of this remarkable Oakland figure.
Yeah. So Miss Margaret, an alternate title of this book was Everybody Knows Miss Margaret, because it's really kind of true. Like, I remember when I was working for The Atlantic, we were at a, conference in Aspen, and Lisa Jackson was there, who was then head of the EPA. And I had run into Miss Margaret, and of course, Lisa Jackson knew Miss Margaret, right? But if you're like in West Oakland and you're running around, you run into somebody, the chances they know Miss Margaret there are also very high, you know. So she has this incredible ability to transcend sort of class and racial boundaries in really interesting ways. Um, he really is a figure who trained at the feet of the kind of some other legendary women in the Bay Area, a group of community leaders in Bayview Hunters Point, which shares a lot of conditions and history with West Oakland as part of this kind of archipelago of Black communities in which many maritime workers came before and after World War II and were sort of pinned there by the various terrible components of American real estate. And so though she kind of goes underground for several decades as she's sort of raising her family and struggling with her own issues, her kind of lineage of community leadership goes right back to sort of the most prominent Black women leaders in the Bay Area, which I think is pretty significant. One of her husbands also was a kind of more theoretical leader within the sort of Black communist tradition. Also worked for ILWU, which is the sort of Longshore Union, another kind of component of this book. So she has a pedigree, like a kind of underground pedigree of all these different components of community leadership. All that said, there's only one Miss Margaret, and that is, I think her willingness to remain herself in all settings is pretty rare. Like I've seen her in many different settings. I've seen her at fancy nonprofit stuff. I've seen her like working on the street. I've seen her at her birthday parties, like dancing and drinking. I've seen her at there's sort of a Black-led radical ecology lab that's coming together in Oakland, that's sort of a much younger generation. It's very like Gen Z, Instagram, hipster ecology. And like Miss Margaret there too. You know what I mean? She's just a fascinating
Yeah, she's
figure. And
utterly compelling, utterly compelling.
yeah.
I'll let the readers find it on their own, but there's one moment where she's meeting with dignified city officials and offers that their ideas don't comport with West Oakland's needs or wants, sort of verbatim. And then outside, she drops her guard and says actually what's really on her mind, which is
Yeah, which is
that moment. Yeah.
yes, NSFW.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
yeah.
So, as expected, we're just about out of time. It's a fascinating book. I urge everyone out there, if you do not know the Pacific Circuit, my suggestion would be to think of it as a handbook, an introduction to West Oakland, which you should take in situ. I would say take
Mm,
it to West Oakland,
mm.
sit with it, look outside the coffee house or wherever you may be, the park, wherever you may be, pick a bus stop, bench, wherever. Use it as a guide to trying to understand the rhythms of this place that are so deeply seated in such massive global changes. And at the same time, it maintains this tapestry of a impacted, but tapestry nonetheless of a
Mhm,
remarkable
mhm,
neighborhood.
mhm, mhm.
So I'm just going to give you the last word, Alexis, before we may have a couple of questions. Can we look at the book and what you've uncovered and the figures you have who are resilient and brave and courageous? Can we look at it through any redemptive light?
Well, I think maybe the light I would choose to look at it through, like a kind of a takeaway for modern living. Um, I think that the impact of logistics in the world, like the way that goods movement has affected urban life, and in some ways increasingly supplanted it. That people, logistical scholars have kind of proposed that there is this kind of logistical self that's rounding into shape, right? That we no longer might see ourselves as being in the city in the ways that we might have in the 19th century, even in the 1980s, right? that what has happened to these small towns via Walmart getting wiped out in particular ways as they find a new interface into the world's goods through Walmart is kind of happening in our cities. And the pandemic, I think, pulled forward some future. And I think it did it before we had a chance to really metabolize what was happening. And what really crystallizes this for me is that Oakland was voted by Condé Nast Traveler the best food city in America. And I know lots of restaurateurs here. I mean, I just know lots of people in the community, and they're all like, what are they talking about? We can't keep our doors open. We can't get anyone to come in. It's like, DoorDash has shaved off a piece of their business, and Amazon has shaved off a piece of all these other businesses, and Temu and the fast fashion people and all these things. And I think that my worry, and maybe, but also there is a redemptive component to it. I'm coming back to that. My worry is that we sleepwalk our way into a place where we no longer have the third spaces that we need for a vibrant city anywhere, that they just don't exist anymore. We've put all that stuff on kind of digital rails, and it no longer circulates through our own local economies. The good thing is all you have to do is go patronize. You have to just go be a resident of the city. That's the answer. In some ways, there's policy stuff you could do. Sure, there's all kinds of stuff you could try and do. But like a lot of the answer is like inside, and I think that's important. It's important to recognize sometimes that there are things you can do, and all you have to do is live in your city for real. So.
Right, and come together through book forums and talk about interesting, important books with
Yeah,
one another.
yeah.
Yeah.
All you have to do is go have fun in the city. You have to just go walk around, I mean, it's amazing. There's some types of community organizing that are hard, and there's other types that are very easy, and that's the latter.
Yeah.
This is one of the latter.
Well, congratulations on a really, I think, remarkable achievement. It's a really
Thank you.
powerful, important book, and
Thank you,
it was
Bill.
a real pleasure to chat today. Thank you.
Yeah, same here. Thank you.
Beth, we're ready.
All right, I'm zooming back in. We've got a lot of comments and a few questions. Just a few comments to mention. Stephen points out the urban renewal in Oakland began with the FHA of the New Deal.
Absolutely. There's possibly too much of that in this book, but there was even more before. If you want an earlier draft, yes, I totally agree.
Got chopped, got edited out. The post office also hired, Donna points out, the post office also hired many African American women who had worked in defense factories during World War II and were displaced from jobs in their neighborhood. So
there's a great book about that too, called There's Always Jobs at the Post Office, I think it's called. Great, like fascinating book about the things. Yeah.
Harold asks, has Oakland's current crime rate personally affected you? I don't know.
Well, who hasn't had their window of a car knocked out? It's a fascinating question, like the issue of sort of crime and public safety in a place like Oakland. I We had something happen in 2023 where crime started to go down everywhere else and it went up in Oakland. This is one of the great outstanding mysteries of, I think, modern life, which is what makes crime go up and down. I don't actually think that anyone knows, and this is not an Oakland specific observation, but I think it holds as well here as for anywhere else. I remember writing a big story about this for the Atlantic at the low point for crime nationally, which was right before the pandemic. You had from the peaks in the 1960s to that time, crime in some cities and in some types of crime, had fallen like 80, 90%, and everyone was like, what happened? And no one even knew who could take credit for it. And of course, on the other side of it, when crime starts to go back up, people say, oh, well, it's X and Y and Z. But if you can't explain why crime went down, how do you explain how crime went up? And I think that's always been a very fraught discussion here in town and across the whole Bay Area. That's what I would say about crime in Oakland.
Yeah, my car's been broken into in San Francisco. Not in Oakland, but in San Francisco many times.
Yes.
All right. Tracy asks, just geographically, for those of us who aren't familiar with Oakland, what exactly is West Oakland? Can you just describe kind of where it's located?
West Oakland is sort of, there's a couple different ways to think about it. It's where the Bay Bridge has its landing, so it's actually the part of Oakland that's closest to San Francisco. It's also what's directly across from Alameda. I saw that was part of the question. Another way you could find it is look for the big cranes. That's the edge of West Oakland. That all of that stuff is ways of thinking about West Oakland. It's also where the original shoreline was. And then everything that you see that has cranes on it is stuff that was sort of built into the bay. That was part of the great infilling of the bay before that was stopped in the 1960s.
Is it true that George Lucas used those cranes for the
A perennial question. He denies it, but just look at him. Come on.
I got an at being built out of Legos on my dining room table.
Yeah. He denies it, but I think it was in his subconscious.
Last question. Most sad excision decision.
Oh, that scrap on the floor.
That's a tough one for a writer.
That's a tough one. I would say I developed like a specific and burning hatred for one FHA official named Homer Hoyt, uh, who developed the ways of sort of mapping, kind of explaining redlining to the bureaucracy. And Homer Hoyt, in particular, one thing I really was frustrated with him is that he recognized that what the FHA was doing was racist in a way that other officials didn't openly recognize. But he thought it was just the way of the city. And so one of the things that he said is, that he expected neighborhoods to repel invaders. I mean, this is all the language of these guys, right? That urban change is driven by racial invasion. And as one racial or ethnic group invades the next, it drives this whole kind of process of change. And Homer Hoyt kind of recognized that this would have a disproportionate and terrible impact on any marginalized racial or ethnic group. But he did the bureaucratic mechanism anyway. He built those things anyway so that the FHA could deny loans to people. And that's really frustrated me that someone could have such an obvious understanding of who would be hurt by these policies and do it anyway. So anyway, that
Next
it
book
just
is What Homer Knew.
yeah, what Homer knew. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. Even the Homer meme where he's backing into the bush, that's like
bushes?
very much.
Homer Simpson.
That's also Homer Hoyt too, He's just like, well, this is just how it's gonna go, That always frustrated me.
For those who do not send text gifts, there's a thing of Homer Simpson backing into the bushes, just not one.
Yes, disappearing. Yeah.
Alexis, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, to join Alta
Yeah.
Live. Bill Deverell, thank you for your wonderful review. I put it in the chat. Folks, don't worry. We will also send you, my wonderful colleague Liz Casillas has been keeping copious notes. So anything that
Thank you.
popped up during today's conversation, Alexis's book recommendation, where you can buy his book, where you can read Bill's review, or you can do the forum. Please check for that later this afternoon in your email. I will get this video
awesome.
on YouTube and shoot it to you. Also join us next week. We're going to welcome Chris Sickles, who creates, these are actually sculptures. This is not an illustration. This is a sculpture.
That's great.
Yes. So Chris is going to join us from his studio and show us how he makes these incredible creations that he then sells. They're pieces of artwork, and we use them in Alta. Join us. That's next Wednesday at 12:30. Again, the Pacific Circuit. I sound like Larry King. The book, The Pacific Circuit. Again, we'll send you a link where to buy that and how to support indie booksellers as you do. Thank you both. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to you both. Thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Alexis. Thanks, Beth.